Welcome back. Once again, my name is Avery Clark, and today I'll be going over assignment 5 in SQL. And I'm going to start with the Shopify system once again. What we did was we created a sales summary table and a store procedure to insert into the sales summary table. The table itself is pretty straightforward. We've done a lot of these at this point. Um, Sale ID is going to be that primary key, with customer ID being a foreign key to the customer's table. Then we have various other columns, whether or not the invoice has been paid, different date times like year, month, etc., and different data types, numerics, bits, varchar, etc. Pretty straightforward. And how we insert data. We've got the store procedure, called it create new sales summary. And so we're inserting into the sales summary table data from the sales details table. So basically, we're just taking the sales details table, which is a very granular look. Each sale can have lots of different line items, and those all appear as their own lines. So there's a lot of data in there, and we don't necessarily want to see it that granularly. We might want to zoom out, get more of a bird's eye view on our data. And the sales summary table is just a way to rearrange that data so we can do that. So yeah, like I said, we're inserting data from the sales details into the sales summary. We're selecting sales ID, customer ID, the most recent invoice date, the total sale, which is obviously just summing up all the line totals that match the sales ID. Same with number SKU and the number of units. We're counting the number of products and the number of units. And obviously, yes, like I said, this is from the sales details table and for each sale. So where the sales ID equals the most recent sales ID in that details table. And then we're also going to update the sales summary table. We're setting paid to true, paid is a bit, true or false, one or two, or sorry, 0 or 1. But we're setting it to true, obviously. If the transaction's been completed, we can assume that they've been paid. And we're choosing the most recent. How this works is we're taking the most recent sale. So we update right after it happens. So it happened today, 0 days ago, today. And then, excuse me, we take the invoice date and we chop it up and we take all these different pieces of data out of it using these little functions. So we grab the month from the date, we use that to update the month column. We grab the name of the month, like January, February, etc., and we put that into the month in text. Same with year and year in text. We pull the year out of the date part from the invoice date, and for year in text, we convert it to in varchar. And let's see, a couple of case statements because, well, as opposed to an if statement, because an if statement is just sort of if else, there's two options, but we want multiple different cases. So we can create our own sort of ranges that the numbers can fall into in a case statement. So for example, we want the column shift. So was it the morning shift, the graveyard shift, etc.? So, excuse me. When it's the case that the date part, the hour specifically from the invoice date is between this range, then we mark this as overnight. Different for morning, afternoon, night, all these different ranges. Same with supply chain management impact. This is just sort of the size of the number of units. A sale with 2 units is going to be very minimal on the supply chain. It doesn't take a lot of work, not a lot of manufacturing. But 200 units, that's going to make a big impact. And that's about it for this stored procedure. I'll show you what it looks like when we execute. Boom, just like that. Sales ID, total sale, number SKU, number units. There's the invoice date. Yes, it's paid. The year, the month. There's that month in text. 0 days ago today. Shifts overnight, 8 hour, and minimal because there's only 1 unit. All right. I'm going to exit on out of here. And we are going to move on to the Krug Hotel system. And so what we've done is we've created that reservation extra services table to resolve the many-to-many issue. It's a bridge table. Let's take a look at it. We've got that composite primary key between reservation and extra services so that, you can have multiple of the same services, or sorry, multiple services on one reservation and multiple reservations of the same services. Um, then some other columns, the date of the service, the price, whether or not it's been approved by the guest ID, whether or not it's been paid, etc. And if we look down here, again, you can see that composite primary key and approved by guest ID is a foreign key to the guest ID column of the guest table. All right, but before we get to the extra services, we are going to take a look at the stored procedure to check in. We're continuing with the Kobe Hotel system. Last assignment we worked on saving a reservation with that stored procedure, so I'm not going to go over that part. I've just quickly created a new reservation down here that I'm going to use to illustrate the next 3 steps in the process with 3 different stored procedures. The first being check-in. So I've created a stored procedure for check-in. Obviously, the inputs are going to be guest ID, actual check-in date, expected checkout date, and actual number of guests. These can differ from the reservation, check-in, checkout, and guest data. You might need to check in a day late, leave early, maybe there's a new guest. We're allowing a little bit of flexibility there. We're declaring a local variable for the room ID, and we're grabbing the reservation from we're grabbing the reservation ID from the reservations table based on matching guest ID and matching check-in date. So let's say you're a guest, but you have one reservation where you check in a month and one where you check in a year. Those wouldn't conflict, and you can have both of those as different reservations. So if that's null, if they can't find a guest ID that matches and a check-in date that matches, we just print no reservation for guest 102 or whatever. We stop running the program. If it's not null, obviously that means they found something that matched both the check-in date and the guest ID. And then we're going to try to pull out which type of room they reserved by going into that reservations table and grabbing that room type ID that based on the input reservation ID that matches the column found in the table. And then now that we know that, well, they want a queen, now we're going to see, are there actually any queens available? So we're going to count the number of room IDs from the room's database that match the room type that we want. And importantly, are not booked. So this booked is a bit, true or false. So if it's true that they're booked, then we can't book them again. We can't double book like that. So if when we count up that number of unbooked rooms that matches our room type, the answer is 0, then we print, sorry, there's no rooms for that type that are available, and we quit running the program. Now, if that number of rooms is greater than 0, 1 or more, then we're going to select the smallest number, so room 101 before room 102, etc. That matches the room type and is not booked already. And then we're going to update some information. But first, we're going to grab that number of days by just calculating the difference between the actual check-in date and the expected checkout date. So, if there's 5 days between, then you're staying for 5 days. And now we update the reservations table. All this that was input, we're now making sure it's actually correct. So maybe you checked in a day early. That's fine. Maybe you're going to check out a day early. That's fine. Maybe the number of guests has changed. Room type ID shouldn't change, but number of days may have changed if one of these changed. And we didn't know the room ID before. That was null, but now it's being updated. Oh yes, and now we're updating that room um, the booked room now says true for that room ID. And we'll say guests checked into room number blank. All right. And now we are going to try to execute that. Let's see. Our guest ID is going to be 2. What is our check-in date? Let's 2025 0201. And I'm actually going to change the number of guests. I believe I initially said 1. I'm going to say 3 now. I found 2 people to go on vacation. And let's see. There we go. Guests checked into room 3. So that must have been the lowest available room. And let's quickly check our reservation and see if it updated. All right, reservations table. Edit top 200 rows. Here we go. Yep, number of guests is now 3, and we've been assigned an actual room ID. Great. So we have checked in. What we're going to do now is maybe we want an extra service. One of these wonderful extra services. We have a stored procedure to add services to the reservation. Okay. So our parameters, our inputs are going to be the date at which we're receiving this reservation, the ID of the service reservation, the room number we're receiving it to, guest ID, and the number of units. So you can buy, say, 3 kayaking trips for each one of your 3 children or whatever. Okay. So first, we're grabbing that reservation ID from the reservations table and checking to see that the guest ID matches and the room ID matches. If it doesn't exist, that we can find that reservation that matches and is open. What that means is when you create a reservation, it automatically defaults to being open. And then when we check out, it will switch to closed or it'll say false. Because that's a bit 1-0 true false. And basically that means if I come back a year later, I'm not adding things to that old reservation, maybe added to my new reservation, which is automatically opened. Sorry, but yeah, so if that reservation is not pulling up with the correct reservation ID or it's not open, then we would say that's not a valid reservation and return to close the program. So if it is valid, oh, sorry. Oh no. So if it doesn't exist, sorry, my mistake, from the extra services table, where there's a service ID that matches the one we've input. So if you input service ID 10 and there is no service ID 10, we just print, check the service ID number with return. Standard data constraint right there. And we're getting the service price. So we're pulling it out of the extra services table, selecting that price column that matches the service ID that we've input. Same for the service name, pulling it out of the extra services table that matches that service ID. Now, excuse me. Now we're seeing if it's new or not. So, for example, if this is the second, let's say you ordered wine delivered to your room yesterday, and now you're ordering it again, we wouldn't create a new line item. We would just say, we would just add to your order. But if it doesn't exist, so if your specific reservation ID has not had this extra service ID before, so maybe you've had a different extra service, but you haven't had this one yet, then we're going to insert that new line with reservation ID, extra service ID, etc. These values being input here. And then we're going to say X number of cakes or whatever services added to the reservation. then we end. But if it's not new, if you already have ordered, like I said, wine to the room, so if it exists in that table where the IDs match up and open is true, so it's still, I guess you could say your tab is still open, it's still running. And if it exists where the reservation ID matches the input one and the extra service ID matches the extra service input. So basically, the same reservation is getting the same extra service. Then we're going to update the previous line. So basically, instead of adding a new row, we're just updating the previous row. We're adding to the units of service by however many more you're getting. Let's see. Yeah, that's about it. And then we print how many more units of that service have been added to that order, and that's all. Okay. Now we are going to add an extra service to that same reservation. All right, I would like to do a kayak tour. That's service ID 3. So now we're going to add an extra service. Add services. Here we go. Execute. Service date 2025 0202. If I say, I think that was extra service 3. And now we've been assigned a room ID because we've already checked in. So I know that's room ID 3. And I am guest ID 2. And I'm getting 1 kayak tour. All right, 1 unit of kayak tour has been added to the reservation. Fantastic. And then exit out of that. Oh, and here you can see reservation 4, the reservation I just made with that 3, that kayak trip. It's $40, 1 unit, and it has not been paid yet. So we've updated that extra services table. And then last but not least, we're going to check out. And here's a sort procedure to do so. And the only inputs we need now are the guest ID, the checkout time. So we're grabbing that reservation ID. We're selecting the maximum reservation ID from the reservations table that matches our guest ID. So the most recent guest ID, in other words. Okay, so we are setting the price per night by selecting it from the room types table because each room type has its own price per night. So we're grabbing the room type associated with our reservation in the reservations table, and we're putting that room, we're checking to see which room type that corresponds to and which price per night from the room types table. And then we're grabbing the room ID that matches our reservation table. And check-in date, we're grabbing that from the reservation table as well because we've already input that and it's paired with our reservation ID. And then to calculate like the total price, you have to know how many nights you stayed. So we're going to grab the, number of days based on the difference between the actual check-in date and the actual checkout date. And we're going to grab the extra services. We're going to sum up the price of the services times units of the service from that reservation extra services bridge table that matches with our reservation ID. So now we go into the reservations table and we set the checkout date to the actual checkout date time. So it's no longer the expected checkout date, it's the real checkout date. The number of days is the number of days that we've calculated by subtracting the check-in date from the checkout date. And that room fee is going to be the price per night, which we calculated based on the room type table up top, times the number of days, which we calculated, like I said previously. And that extra services fee is the extra services that we summed up here from the reservation extra services table, obviously for our specific reservation ID. And now we are updating the reservations table. The subtotal is going to be the room fee plus the extra services fee, tax. We've picked sort of an arbitrary percentage to add on to it, adding onto the subtotal. We're updating open question mark to false. So we are closing this reservation. So if you recall previously in the store procedure to add an extra service, it checked to see if it was open still so that we could add an extra service. And now you could no longer add extra service. So our tab is closed, in other words. And we're going to say reservation 4 is closed. And now we're going to unbook the room. So we're updating the rooms table. We're setting booked to false. It is no longer booked for that specific room ID. And we're going to say the room is now available. And then we're updating that reservation extra services table, which has that paid column that either it's a bit, it's true or false, and it's true now. We've checked out, so we've paid. And we're going to say extra services for that reservation are closed. All right. And now I'm going to walk us through that. We're going to stored procedure. All right, so guest ID is going to be 2, and checkout date, I'll say I checked out when I was supposed to. Oh. All right, there we go. Reservation closed. Room 3 is now available. We've closed our tab. There we go. So now let's go ahead and refresh and look at our reservations table. And we can see that checkout date, and it has calculated our room fee, our extra services fee, our tax, subtotal, total with tax, I suppose needs to be calculated. I left that out. I will go back in and I will update that. That's unfortunate. And now it is no longer open. So that's no longer true. We've closed our tab, in other words. And the rooms, room 3 should be, I believe it was room 3 is now false. It is no longer booked. All right. That is how the system works. I did not go through very many of the data constraints, or at least I did not show them in action, simply because this was such a long video with so many stored procedures. But thank you so much for your time.